Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the webinar series on coronavirus today. I'm Edna, a biotechnology student from Imperial College London, and it's a pleasure to be your student host today. Before we begin, I would like to say a huge thank you to the Hong Kong Life Science Society for organizing this webinar, which I'm sure will be very insightful. We're also very pleased to have Andy with us today, tell us all about science communication. Andy is an award-winning journalist and program leader of the Masters in Science Communication program at the University of West England, Bristol. Andy has spent 20 years in the profession, most recently as deputy editor of BBC Focus and then the launch editor of Science Uncovered. Prior to that, he has worked as a reporter and news editor in local newspapers and was also a journalist writing for News Weekly, New Scientist, The Economist, and Men's Health. He's also made regular appearances on BBC Radio talking about science news. On top of that, Andy has extensive experience of digital publishing and was named Specialist Publication of the Year twice and the Editorial Person of the Year in the BBC Magazine Awards for Excellence in 2010. There's no better person to talk to us about science communication than Andy. In this webinar, Andy will outline what science communication is, as well as its importance and relevance to many professional sectors and careers. There'll be a time for Q&A afterwards, so listen up and save your questions to the end. Without further ado, let's welcome Andy.
Thank you, Edna. That was a fantastic introduction. Welcome along to this session. And firstly, thank you so much to the Hong Kong Life Sciences Society and Ken and Virginia for inviting me along. It's an absolute pleasure to be able to spend some time talking to you about science communication because there's never been a better time given coronavirus to be talking and thinking about science communication. So as Edna outlined, the plan for today is to sort of give you a bit of an insight into what science communication is in all its different forms, and also give you an insight into why it's so important now and why it's so important for scientists and researchers and students just like yourself to get involved with science communication. And hopefully that will really whet your appetite ready for the second webinar that I'll be hosting in a week or so's time, where I'll be telling you a little bit about some research that we've been doing in science communication and some insights that gives into today's issues in science communication and the challenges, but also some ideas on how to get involved and some sort of introduction to some science communication techniques that hopefully you'll be able to use in your work. So hopefully now I will share my slides with you and we'll get started. So as Edna says, the idea is that I'll give you the introduction, then there'll be some time at the end for you to ask any questions that you have. So feel free to ask questions and I'll do my very best to answer them. In today's session then, I'll give you that introduction to science communication and we'll think about why communication is important, and I'll give you an insight into some issues and challenges and how to get involved in science communication. And Edna gave you a really good sort of overview of what my background and what I've been doing. So I won't linger on this too long, but my background is perhaps a little bit unusual for an academic in that I've spent most of my working life as an active science journalist. And quite a bit of that time was spent on the BBC's Science magazine, so a popular science magazine aimed at people who have an interest in science but don't necessarily have a background in it, so they're not scientists. And that's called BBC Science Focus. And I still write. I love writing. It's an opportunity to speak to some fascinating scientists, as I did already this morning. First thing that I did was do an interview and employ a bit of creativity, a bit of creative thinking about how we're going to tell the story of science in a way that's going to engage people and help them to understand. So these are some of the sort of the recent articles that I've written. I wrote a cover story for Focus about the search for a vaccine for coronavirus, and you've probably seen the news that there seems to be some quite good news about that recently. But I write on a sort of a wide range of topics. Another one was research into dogs and how they age, and how that might help us understand more about how we age as humans. But I've written for quite a few other publications, as Ed mentioned as well. As an academic, I'm based at the University of the West of England in Bristol, in the UK, and I'm part of the university's science communication unit. So it's a sort of world-renowned science communication unit, and it's involved in research into science communication. And I'm going to tell you about some of the research that we do in this webinar, and in particular the next one. So one of the projects that is quite prominent in our research at the moment is called Rethink. So it's a research project that is taking place across Europe. And it's looking into how science is communicated online, its different forms, who's involved, and it's also looking at how people understand scientific information, because that's often something that we've not had that much information about, believe it or not. So how do people interpret what they read and what they watch online, and how do they assimilate that and make decisions based on what they've seen? So I'll tell you a bit more about that in the course of these two webinars. We also run a master's course, an MSc in science communication, and just as a sort of an overview, another of the things I'm involved with is the Max Perutz Science Writing Award, which is run by the Medical Research Council in the UK. I'm involved with judging that, and it's aimed at PhD students, and they get to write piece that's aimed at a national newspaper, and it's about their research in life science. So it's sort of very much of relevance to kind of the area that you're interested in. So let's turn to what science communication is. I've put a couple of definitions here because, believe it or not, within the field there is discussion and debate about how we define science communication. But there's a really sort of simple, clear definition that I like, which is it's communication about science with people who don't have professional expertise in the field. I think that's the easiest way to think about it. So it's not communicating about science through things like academic publications, because they're aimed at people who are other researchers in that field or a related field, but it's pretty much everything else. So it's communicating your research or the research of others to people who aren't experts. So members of the public, but in lots of various different forms. But there are lots of alternative definitions, one of which I've provided here, which is the use of appropriate skills, media activities and dialogue to produce one or more of the following personal responses to science. So awareness, enjoyment, interest, opinion forming and understanding. And I've given you that definition just because I suppose it points to the different effects that the way that we communicate science can have. And that's one of the things that we consider is, well, why are we communicating science? What is it that we're trying to do? Is it just so that people can enjoy science like we do? Or is it to allow them to inform their opinions about sort of areas of research? And I'm going to talk about that in a little bit. So there are lots of reasons that you would want to communicate science. I've given a few examples here of different forms of science communication. So my background is in written science communication, so in things like newspapers and magazines, that sort of thing. But that doesn't cover, that's just a small proportion of the way that science is communicated. So, you know, within Hong Kong, if that's where you're based, there's Hong Kong Science Museum, fantastic science museum, which is a place where science gets communicated. People go there as families, as individuals, and learn about research. Often they're not people who are involved in research themselves. Hong Kong's also hosted fantastic science festival, and that's involved things like, you know, open outdoor fairs, drama shows, and film reviews where members of the public go in and watch science fiction films and discuss the way the science is communicated in that. And I think that kind of gives a real insight into the sort of creative approaches that are used to communicate science. It's not just in the written form. I've provided another few examples here, so science, people have made comedy out of science, not to sort of make fun of it, but just to sort of share a passion and an interest and to sort of engage people with it. And obviously there's science on TV as well. But increasingly these days, science is communicated online. And, there are things like YouTube channels. I've given the example here of ASAP Science. And to give you an idea of the scale of that as a science communication platform, it has 9.44 million subscribers around the world. So it's huge. That's a huge way that people are getting to learn and understand about science in a very effective way. But on your phone, you can download apps which will teach you a form of science that you're not familiar with. I've given a sort of an example here, complete anatomy, but from the whole range of science and health sciences, there are different apps. Whether you're interested in astronomy, you can point your phone at the sky these days and learn about constellations and a bit of the sort of history of astronomy through apps, and a whole range. But also a lot of research projects these days have their own web presences. And I've given the example here of a project that's close to my heart because I love dogs, called the Dog Aging Project, which is a project that I wrote about for the cover feature that I mentioned a little while ago, which is looking at how dogs age. And you would think, first thing you might think, well, why would we be interested in that unless you're particularly interested in dogs? But really, why it's interesting is because dogs often share our homes. They're kind of they're in the same environments as us. They do very similar exercise to us. So a lot of the factors that influence how well they age, we share. So from that point of view, it's really interesting to look at what factors influence how they age. So this project, the Dog Aging Project, is one where members of the public are able to take various measurements of their dog and contribute data to the research team and learn about how their own dog is aging and follow it over time and learn about those sorts of factors. So in doing so, that's communicating science to the outside world. But there's also things like social media. So whether it's Facebook, whether it's Weibo, whether it's Snapchat, whether it's Twitter, to be honest, there's not a platform now where science communication doesn't take place. But also, one area of science communication that is increasingly important, and it's an area where communication and doing research get mixed together, is what you may have heard of this term, citizen science. So it's when members of the public are involved in the research process themselves. So they're not just learning about science, they're actually doing it as well. And I've given an example here. I don't know whether you can kind of read the title of this paper, but it's Citizen Science, an Alternative Way for Water Monitoring in Hong Kong. And this is a citizen science project that took place in Hong Kong, where members of the public, most of which I think were recruited from HSBC, a bank, and they managed to get about 250 volunteers who were tasked with measuring different parameters, different sort of variables in the rivers in and around sort of Hong Kong. So, rivers such as the River Indus and the Cantin River, they were taking samples, taking measurements. And the idea of this project was just simply to look at how accurate their measurements as members of the public were compared to the sort of official measures of water quality. So things like pH and temperature and other sort of variables. And they found they were really accurate. But science was communicated through this project as well. It wasn't just a way of gathering data. Each person who took part in this was offered a day of training, in which case they learned about those sampling techniques, but also learned about the sort of importance of measuring water quality and what we can learn about it. So again, science is being communicated. And so that's increasingly an avenue for gathering data, but also communicating science with members of the public. But science is also communicated in other places. Sometimes it's not the kind of the reason that these things are created. So I'm just thinking here about some films that some of which you may have watched. So one that springs to mind is The Martian, which I don't know whether you've watched it, but it's a film about an astronaut who gets trapped on Mars, and how he survives, but also how he returns to Earth. And that film's been praised for how accurate the science is in it. So how the astronaut who's trapped there grows plants, grows food, the gravity sort of sling mechanism that's used to return him back to Earth. A lot of the science that's embedded within that story is accurate. It's communicating the science of interplanetary travel, I suppose. There's another great film, Gattaca. It's well worth a watch if you've not seen it. It's about a future where all of us have our genetic codes sort of measured and assessed, but also gene editing is really sort of quite common. So again, there's a lot of science that's embedded within that film. So we each of us are sort of in this sort of ecosystem, a wider ecosystem, whether we realize it or not, of taking in science, and that applies to you as students, but also other members of the public who aren't involved in learning about science immediately. So that's what science communication is. Lots of different forms, a very sort of lively area, a very creative area to get involved in. But let's spend a bit of time thinking about, well, why is science communication important? And I think giving this webinar at this moment in time, it's impossible to sort of avoid talking about coronavirus. And obviously it's a theme for these webinars overall. And I think what the past few months have shown is the extent to which the way science is communicated influences human behaviour. So I don't know about you, but say 12 months or so ago, I think most members of the public would not have heard of something called the R number, apart from, unless you're an epidemiologist, which is the sort of effective reproduction number, which is the measure of how rapidly a virus or whatever it is spreading through a population. So obviously it's been a key measure of how readily coronavirus is spreading within a particular country or region. Now, the R number is a figure that has often been discussed in news reports and sort of coverage online, and is used to explain and justify certain restrictions that have been introduced. So members of the public have been introduced to this term from epidemiology, and it helps them to understand why new restrictions, new regulations, it's certainly what's happening in the UK at the moment, are being introduced. So that's a very clear form of science communication. I mean, in many countries as well, there have been debates about the efficacy, the effectiveness of wearing face masks. And I think, several countries such as Hong Kong and Taiwan and South Korea have kind of led the way here and sort of encouraging it. But a lot of research is being done in looking at how effective face masks are. And subsequent to that, I think where there was quite a bit of skepticism before, now there's evidence that they do offer at least protection for the people around you. And so now we're encouraged to use them. We're encouraged to use them in the UK. And for us, that's quite a new thing. But again, that use is encouraged by the communication of the research that's been taken place. Scientists have done the research. They have proof that this is important and is used to explain and encourage people to wear face masks. I think has been quite effective. But I mean, it's important to stress as well and not get too focused on that the way science is communicated affects many other aspects of our lives. So for instance, whether or not we choose to get vaccinated, whether or not we choose to eat genetically modified food, would we be happy to do that? Most of us are kind of soaking up this science that's communicated and developing ideas and thoughts and attitudes towards these activities. And it very much influences behaviour. So it's really important in lots of spheres of our life. But we live in an exciting time for health science research and life sciences research more broadly. There are lots of opportunities that research offers, you know, in terms of stem cell technology and what we can learn from stem cells and the opportunity that it has in terms of treatments, gene editing technology, and in particular CRISPR, and human enhancements. You know, we're living in an age where we have the potential to enhance our bodies over and above the bodies that we're naturally given, whether that's cognitive abilities or physical abilities. So the ethical questions that these areas of research present are relevant to scientists, but it's not just scientists who should have a say on the research that's done, how it's done, and also how those learnings, how those lessons and how that research is applied to our lives. So, for example, should we enable and allow cognitive enhancements? It presents lots of ethical questions in terms of access and availability, because you can imagine you'll have to pay for this. So, you know, is it only something that's available to those who can afford it? And so there are lots of ethical questions that members of the public need to have a say in. And so it points to the need for a close relationship between science and society, because that enables members of the public to understand about science, but also have a say, and that's really important. So there are wider societal level reasons for needing to get involved in science communication. But also, I'd encourage you to think about what got you interested in science in the first place. It might have been a teacher who was terrific at explaining science. It may have been something that you watched or something that you read. You know, maybe you were a real fan of science fiction books when you were growing up. Maybe it's something that you heard, or maybe it's something in your personal life that really made you think, okay, this is the area that I want to get involved in. This has really sort of inspired me. So a lot of these things are born out of the way science is communicated to us. So within education, but also in the wider world, what is it that kind of sparked our imaginations and make us think this is where we want to spend our career? So in getting involved in science communication, it may be that you can be that person who inspires other people to get involved in learning about science and developing careers in science as well. And that's a really important role for people to have. So that's in itself, that's a good reason to get involved in science communication. So I think it's important to think about some of the challenges that there are in relation to the way that science is communicated. I mean, the fact that increasingly science is communicated online is an opportunity. It's given a lot of people who wouldn't have been able to communicate science the opportunity to do it. And, you know, certainly it's far easier now for students, scientists and others to write a blog or post on social media about science. And that's a great thing. But it's also allowed a lot of information that isn't under anyone's sort of editorial control to be presented online. And that's presented us with quite a few challenges. And I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about vaccination in particular, because that's one sort of area where there's been a lot of communication online and it's presented some issues. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some research that a colleague of mine within the Science Communication Unit, Elena Milani, who has recently completed her PhD, and what she spent her research time looking at is the way that vaccination is communicated on Twitter, the social media platform. And in particular, who's talking to who on Twitter, who's sharing whose information, who is kind of tweeting other people's communications and who is having conversations. And what you can see in front of you is a kind of a map, a representation of those connections that that Elena was able to find through her analysis of Twitter and conversations about vaccines. So the links in blue are tweets and retweets that are pro-vaccination. So encouraging people to get vaccination, good news about vaccines and how effective they are. The links in red, the lines in red, are tweets and retweets that are anti-vaccination, so sort of raising questions about the sort of the health risks and how effective vaccines are. You might also be able to see some sort of blue links, and that's news. That's kind of news from places like newspapers about vaccines as well. And I think that the big sort of take-home message from this research, and you can kind of see in a broad way in this diagram, is that those who are pro-vaccine, those who are anti-vaccine, just aren't talking to one another. There are very few linkages between one another. So they're using different hashtags. They don't sort of exchange information at all. So while you might think that social media is this kind of wide open space where we're all able to talk to one another and have a conversation and discuss and debate, that certainly in relation to vaccination just doesn't happen. Separate conversations are taking place that unfortunately in some instances reinforce existing beliefs, which is particularly worrying when it comes to things like anti-vaccination conversations. Those who are anti-vaccinations aren't engaging, listening, discussing with those who are pro-vaccination. So it kind of reinforces, all they're doing is reinforcing their own sort of beliefs. And the challenges around vaccination are sort of evident when we look at things like, there was a report published in 2018 by, it's called the Wellcome Global Monitor Report, and it looked at the communication of various sort of health-related issues around the world. And this chart looks at perceptions of the safety of vaccines in members of the public in different regions across the world. And just to sort of point out, the question that this relates to is, do you strongly believe that, well, do you agree, disagree, or with a statement that vaccines are safe? And those in the yellow band are the proportion who strongly agree that vaccines are safe. In the sort of blue band is somewhat agree. And then, you know, as you go through, like the pink band is strongly disagree. And what you can see is there's a large variation across the world in the extent to which people strongly agree that vaccines are safe. And which is interesting in its own right. And you know, certainly in sort of Western Europe, only 36% of people strongly agree that vaccines are safe. And this is important because it influences behaviour. It influences whether people choose to get vaccinated themselves, but also whether their children get vaccinated as well. So it presents some challenges. And there's also some interesting information that came out from that same report. So in high income countries, people who say they're finding it difficult, and this is economically, so that they don't feel that they're sort of have a lot of money, they don't feel like they find it easy financially. So they are 3 times less likely than those who say they're living comfortably to say that science benefits them personally or science as a whole. So economics has a big influence on people's perceptions of science. But also there are other studies that kind of give us a wider context on these sorts of challenges. So across many countries, people with higher levels of education are more trusting of the media and consume more news from higher quality sources. So with that, we're talking about the established media, so sort of established newspapers where there are editorial standards and regulations. So other people are getting their information from less regulated sources, often from social media. So it means there are kind of gaps in trust, as I've described it here, in news. So those who have less education are more likely to use sources such as social media and less likely to use those sort of high quality sources of information, at the same time as being less trusting in science. So those two things seem to be in some way related. So coming back to coronavirus, as that's obviously a theme for these webinars, I saw this term infodemic. So alongside the pandemic, there has been an infodemic online, a flood of information about the spread of viruses and coronaviruses and what they are, as people are searching for information and advice and guidance online. It's sort of transformed online communication in that sort of realm. And there's some research in this area that I suppose is a source of concern, but also a bit of a source of optimism, because you might think, okay, well, what do we do about this? You know, we know that the opinions that people have and what they trust is influenced by their background and the context that they live in. And we know that a lot of their activities and their behaviour and their attitudes is shaped by what they read and watch online. So what can we learn about this? So there was a sort of a group of researchers who looked at misinformation in relation to coronavirus online, the nature of that. They looked in particular at Twitter. So what is the content of that, of those tweets? But also, how are those sort of challenges overcome? So the tweets that kind of debunk that misinformation. So the sorts of misinformation they were looking at were things like, sort of incorrect information about how gargling seawater or salt water or mouthwash could protect you against coronavirus, which just obviously isn't true. But this is a sort of an idea that has been circulating on Twitter as misinformation. And as I say, unfortunately, people do believe what they read online. And what they found in terms of the content of these tweets is that quite often the misinformation didn't attribute the information to specific sources. So they might describe the researchers coming from Taiwanese researchers or health experts, but without giving any specific information about who specifically said this, whereas the accurate information was more likely to link it to sort of attributable sources. So a specific researcher, specific organizations, maybe even providing a link to that organization and the research that's being done. So in a way, I see this as a kind of a source of optimism, in that there are recognizable differences between misinformation and accurate information. And it really points to the urgent need for more education around how we look at and interpret information online. And it needs to be something that is ingrained in our education systems, because once people leave school, for the most part, a lot of the way that they learn about science is online. So it's important to sort of ingrain good techniques in terms of recognizing credible information. But I suppose one of the slightly worrying things is that they looked at the debunking tweets, so the tweets that kind of refuted the sort of misinformation about sort of whether gargling salt water or mouthwash could actually stop you from getting coronavirus, which is obviously not true. And what they found was that there was a lag of several days from those initial misinformation tweets to the accurate information going out. And that presented an opportunity for that misinformation to circulate and percolate through networks. And that's a particular problem, because other research has shown that once people have formed ideas and read information, it's very hard to unsettle that and switch them to a different perspective. So again, it really points to the need for sort of rapid campaigns of like debunking incorrect information online. mean, I don't have any solutions as to how we do this, because obviously this is a commitment to time for people, and all of us are very busy. But it's an interesting idea and an interesting sort of area to explore. And there is a real need for this, and maybe it's something that scientists and students can get involved in. So all of this sort of points to the fact that there's just never been a more important time to communicate science. And also, there's a quote here that's often attributed to Albert Einstein, but it's also been attributed to several other people as well. So I can't sort of say that this is definitely something that Albert Einstein said, but you don't really. He allegedly said, you don't really understand something unless you can explain it to your grandmother. I suppose unless your grandmother's already a scientist. The idea here is that if you're trying to explain something to someone who is not already familiar with your area of science, it really makes you think about your knowledge of that. So if any of you have been trying to sort of explain your area of research, what you're studying, to members of your family, you'll have come across this sort of challenge. How do you really explain it? And you find that you have to see your research and your work and what you're learning about through a completely different lens, and really have to understand it to be able to do that. So of in itself, just one motivation to get involved with science communication is to help you to understand what you're learning about, what you're researching about, and see it through that kind of new lens. Because as many of us have been involved in teaching as well, will know that you really do have to understand to be able to explain something very effectively. So the good news is there's lots of different ways that we can get involved in science communication, and I think hopefully some of the sort of places where science communication takes place, like Hong Kong Science Museum, science festivals. I know from students that I have I've been teaching, a lot of them love sort of getting involved with science centres. We have one in Bristol, and many of our students have sort of worked there voluntarily, and that's given them a passion for kind of working in that field, and getting involved in science festivals and events, or maybe talking about science on stage, getting involved in sort of other areas. But at the very least, the sort of easiest thing that we can do is create our own blog, and there are lots of sort of platforms out there that can enable you to start and sort of build your own blog on science. And many sort of science communicators have built and developed their career in this area. But you can post something on YouTube. You can start tweeting about science, or sharing stuff on other platforms as well. Digitally these days, there are lots of different opportunities. And it may be that you start your own blog, or it may be, if you look around, the university or the research centre where you're based maybe has its own blog. And this is perhaps a challenge for Ken. Maybe it's something that Hong Kong Life Sciences Society might want to consider as well. You know, a kind of a student blog. I mean, that can be a really sort of effective way of building a profile. So there are lots of opportunities there, and in the next session, I'm going to talk a little bit more about those opportunities, but also explain to you about sort of useful techniques in science communication as well. But just to point out that there's a global science communication challenge, which is kind of live and active at the moment. I don't know whether you'll have heard of it, but it's called FameLab. And the international final of that is due to take place on the 26th of November. Unfortunately, in terms of sort of Hong Kong time, it's quite late. But the good news is, if you're not able to stay up that late, then I think all those sessions are recorded. So this is really an event at which students at various stages, so whether they're PhD students or at earlier phases, get to talk about their research live on stage. But I think these days it will be kind of on this YouTube channel, and it's really engaging, and it's a great way to learn about other people's research, and so learn about new areas of science that you weren't familiar with, but it's also a great place to learn about effective science communication techniques, because there's a lot of really good, really high quality science communication. So I would encourage you to have a quick look on that YouTube channel and look at the way that science is being communicated within FameLab. So that's it from me. So hopefully that's given you a bit of an insight into what science communication is, and hopefully encourage you to want to get involved as well. So now, hopefully with a bit of help from Edna, we'll leave the floor open to you, and you're welcome to ask any questions that you've got.
Yeah, so thank you, Andy, so much for sharing your insights. I'm sure everyone took a lot out of it. So I guess just to summarize things a little bit, I've got kind of 3 key insights that I've got from the talk. So the first one being that I love how science communication can enhance how data is collected, especially with the citizens collecting water bit. It really changes the way that we can collect data more efficiently. And then the second insight is that science communication is important because the public should have a say in the ethical issues for some of the science advancement, which could be hard to understand, but actually could be quite a significant change in our lives. And then last but not least, with the problem of social media and fake news is worrying, but also it's encouraging to know that there is recognizable differences between credible sources or not. And we should always keep that in mind when we read things online. So yeah, now we move on to the Q&A session. And if anyone has any question, please feel free to click the raise hand button on the participant panel and keep the icon on. I will then call your name and you can unmute yourself to ask the questions. And for those of you who are a bit shy, feel free to type your question in on the chat as well, and I will translate it. Yeah, read it out loud. So if anyone has any burning question, feel free to go ahead. And I will probably kick things off with asking my first question. So I have recently attended a webinar by Roche about COVID-19's impact on cancer, and it's discovered that a lot of the cancer patient has symptoms but then want to go to the hospital to check because of lack of communication. So they think that COVID patients should take priority over them, hospital is overload, and they simply don't want to go out in fear of attracting the virus. So throughout time, they tend to normalize their symptoms and miss the critical time for early treatment. So my question here would be, with COVID being so loud in the media right now, how can we continue raising awareness for other disease area or issues that are by no means less important? Because I think, yeah, the whole world is just banging on about COVID and no one is caring about other issues anymore, if that makes sense.
I think it's a really good question, and I think it's a challenge that sort of is being experienced now in many countries. And I think I'd start by answering that at a very sort of practical level. And I think this is probably the case in many countries as now. I think there's a real sort of emphasis in terms of how the way hospitals are coping with coronavirus is communicated. Because at the start of the pandemic, there was a lot of communication about the challenge and the sort of the capacities of hospitals and the challenges around that. But I think now, in some respects, the conversation has shifted somewhat in terms of what's being communicated about that, in that there is an emphasis on trying to encourage, whether it's cancer patients or other patients, to continue to go to hospital. And, you know, some about that is about answering concerns about safety, you know, so whether there are the fact that there are obviously sort of designated areas, like red areas, as are sometimes described within hospitals, where coronavirus patients are, and that's separate from where other patients would be, but also sort of highlighting the capacities that are within hospitals as well. So I've just found it personally interesting, the shift in the way that communication has taken place. But a bit more broadly, I think it's really hard to give you sort of a definitive answer on how we could do this, because a lot of this is driven very much by people's attention and the concerns that they have, rather than the communication. So as much as we might try and communicate about other sort of areas of disease, it's very much driven by sort of areas of concern that people have. And it's, you know, at the moment, they're really focused on coronavirus. But what I would say is that there is a lot of good, very effective communication already around conditions such as cancer. And so it's just important for that to continue, so that it's there and it's present and people can read it and watch it and see it. And hopefully next year we'll see sort of more optimistic times, and the conversation will be less about that, so it will make life easier. But I just think at the moment it is such a challenging time, and it's influencing things like, you know, the amount of money that's given to charities that are sort of focused on research in cancer. So it's having very sort of real world effects, which there is concern about. So I just think it's important to be part of that kind of science communication ecosystem. And I think, to be honest, that's the best guidance that I can give.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah. People quite quiet now. Okay, go on.
Hi, thanks very much for doing this seminar. I've been interested in psychom for a long time, so thanks for making time for it in Hong Kong. I have a question that's very practical for me at the moment. I've been trying to engage with people online, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and I lived in a kind of a reasonably conservative part of the US when I was a kid. And one of my friends from there is kind of in a bubble that doesn't interact with any other kinds of people that I'm friends with now. So she was sharing kind of information from quite a prominent anti-vaxxer who calls herself a vaccine kind of informer advocate. She doesn't call herself anti-vax. And rather than just talk with my friend, I decided to go to the source page on Facebook to try and, I guess, dialogue with people there. And she immediately blocked me. Not my friend, the page. She's got about 25K followers, maybe plus. I tried on Instagram and was able to kind of have conversations with people over a period of a few weeks, even months, kind of throughout this year. But recently she deleted it. And I don't know if it's because it wasn't just me, but a few other people kind of started having conversations with people that was maybe not what she wanted. Do you have any advice? If I feel like at the moment she's still, she's still sharing all this kind of stuff on Facebook and there's no way for me to get in. Should I tell other people so they can comment, or is it just, no, she's clearly closed the door?
I think what you've been saying has illustrated really effectively just the research that I spoke about earlier on, that my colleague Elena Milani did. When I showed you the diagram of the networks on Twitter, pro and anti-vaccine, I'm sure, and certainly what you're saying reflects the fact that that is also evident on other social media platforms, and it is a real challenge at the moment. Often referred to in research as an echo chamber, the echo chamber effect, the fact that there are distinct networks of people that essentially just reinforce their own opinion and aren't interested in engaging conversation about that. The one thing that kind of research in the area does show, and there's some other research that I've not mentioned that I'm involved with, that I won't give you all the background to it, but it is kind of relevant. And it shows that people are more likely to engage and act on the information that's shared on social media if it's presented in a kind of non-threatening way. So if you're overtly telling people what to think, what to believe, then that's often something that will make people switch off. So it's a case of being quite subtle in what you say and allowing people to inform their own opinions, but I suppose presenting them with information that you sort of deem to be accurate. So again, the thing that you've not got control over is other people's actions. So if they're kind of not letting you kind of link or taking things down, to be honest, there's not a massive amount that you can do there. But I would encourage you to sort of persist. And the other research that I showed you about showing evidence and giving kind of links to specific recognizable sources is important as well, because you would just sort of hope that people will take that into consideration. So I think those are the two main tips. Present the information in a kind of a non-threatening way, and also present that in a way that shows where you've got that information from and its credibility, and hopefully it's these sorts of subtle things that will help. But it's such a key part of the challenges around the way science is communicated online at the moment, and we don't have all the answers, and that, you know, that's what a lot of research is taking place into at the moment. So it's a great question. Are there any others?
Yeah, so we got a question from the audience, Shimin. It's with regards to credibility as well. So he said, with regards to misinformation, the issue of not labeling a specific sources like Taiwanese expert was highlighted. However, this presented in some WhatsApp group with middle or older age group people, and there in the last few months there's been news consisting of selectively cut and paste / edited information from authorities. So it seems like it's reputable sources, but they are circulated in WhatsApp group and all that. So even though they're trying to look for authority and try to do some research, these people might be easily confused and misled as well. So they're wondering if this is a growing trend that has been noted, or
another great question. So so one of the exercises that I do with my MSc students is that I give them 2 articles that relate to medical research, one of which comes from Nature, and one of which comes from a website that has a reputation for fake news, misinformation. I take off everything from that page, which would identify the websites where that information comes from, and I just give them the text. And I say, okay, so which is the accurate information, which is the misinformation? And all they've got to go with is the way that those 2 stories are written. So they're educated in science communication. They know about using reliable and reputable sources. They know about sort of explaining science clearly and really honed in sort of good practice. And yet consistently, they find it nearly impossible to identify what's the fake news and what's the accurate information. So the reason I mention that is that the issue that's been raised here about the challenges of recognizing accurate information is a really big problem. And often that misinformation does very effectively imitate accurate information. So while that research on Twitter did say that often sort of non-attributable sources are used, that's often not the case. You know, there are a lot of websites that are kind of fake news websites about sort of various health treatments and you know, alternative treatments and so on, that are able to very, very effectively mimic how accurate information is presented. And again, I feel like I'm kind of not giving you too many answers and presenting you with lots of problems, but I think this is a state of what we know about this. There are no easy solutions to this, and it is a really big challenge. And you know, even aside from just what's written, quite often with the way that information is presented as well, in terms of, you know, the quality of the websites and things, they look good quality. So yeah, it's a huge problem, and I don't think we have all the answers. As I said before, it speaks to the importance of providing education around interpretation of information online, but even that is quite challenging given the fact that, you know, there are often not clearly identifiable, sort of recognizable characteristics of misinformation. But I'll just mention this very specifically because I've already, you know, if there are any other questions, I want to give an opportunity to talk about those. There is a lot of interesting research that's taking place into how we might be able to develop systems that automatically recognize misinformation online, and the automated fact checking. And that's in its infancy at the moment. And those automated systems are presented with the exact same challenges that we as human beings face. But I think that's a really interesting area of research and a promising one, in that if you can have automated fact checking, then at the very least you can have some kind of automated verification systems provided for information. So hopefully there may be at least some form of technological solution to this, but I think still a need for that sort of education side of things too.
Well, fingers crossed then. Hopefully things get better. And I think I have another question. So you mentioned that science communication, it's going more and more online. So I'm just wondering, do you think there is any downside of it going increasingly digital, with particular focus on maybe digital divide, marginalizing those who can't afford or can't keep up with the technology, like the older generation who probably needs to know more things?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that I suppose I focused on in terms of it's often referred to as the sort of democratization of science communication. So allowing more people to communicate science, which of in itself is a good thing, but there are issues in terms of accessibility of that information, and it's varied between countries and within countries. And obviously, it's reliant in terms of access to the hardware, you know, a good internet connection and so on, if a lot of that information is being communicated online. So it's meant, unfortunately, that, you know, to some degree, less science is communicated through the traditional means, you know, maybe through TV and radio, just because it's shifted online. So yeah, that just, if that answers the question, it does present huge challenges, but I think that's speaks to a wider issue, not just relation to the way science is communicated, about access to the online world and sort of the social issues and the challenges around democratization of access to the online world, and the importance of that is just so important these days.
Very much agreed. Well, I think conscious of time, this is a good time to wrap up. And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to keep it for the next webinar next week. Once again, it was a pleasure to have Andy sharing his insights with us today. And thank you all for joining this webinar. I'm sure everyone will be wanted to learn more about science communication. So please mark your diaries and be punctual for the next webinar session next week, same time, where Andy will cover a more in-depth topic and share with us some case studies, as well as some key considerations and strategies and communications next week. Before you leave, remember to like our Hong Kong Life Science Society Facebook page and follow us on Instagram. Again, thank you so much for your time, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Stay safe, everyone, and have a very good rest of the week.
Cheerio, everyone.
Andy. Thanks, Andy.
Pleasure. Lovely to see everyone, and hopefully see everybody next week.